Thank you. Good afternoon. I presume you can see the slides.
Yep, we can.
That's great. So I'll go in. Regrettably, as we know, we've got to be quick on this, and my presentation's far less intellectual than the ones that have preceded, but I'll do my best here. And I'm going to talk about the issues related to the interface with artisanal and small-scale mining, ASM, and large-scale mining, LSM, or whatever acronym you want to give it. The fact is, we're talking about uncertainty. The fact is that increasingly artisanal mining isn't just a problem on the edge of large scale mining operations. It's part of the operating environment itself. Look, I've spent the last 3 decades at this interface in over 50 countries, and I've worked in some of the most conflict-ridden mine operations in the world. I'm the one who got the call at sort of 2 a.m. when hundreds of armed miners have invaded the pit. And the one thing I can tell you with confidence is this: so much of what we think we know about the artisanal mining sector and what we try and recommend doesn't survive that first contact with some of the mine sites around the world. And look, for this audience, when we're talking about responsible sourcing, that matters beyond the mine gate, because what happens at that interface is already in your supply chain, whether you know it or not. So oh, there we go, that's worked. So look, ASM, artisanal small scale mining, I said I'll use that acronym, is often framed as a development or formalization challenge, something that has to be, be fixed upstream before it becomes your problem. But increasingly, ASM intersects directly with industrial mining operations. Oops, sorry, it went back there. I apologize. The fact is, as I said, from my own experience, they create the interaction between artisan and small scale mining creates even more complex operational, social, environment, government, security problems that don't stay contained at the site level. As I said, over the last few decades, I've been involved in a lot of the responsible sourcing initiatives, from the Kimberley process to the Diamond Development Initiative, Country Gold, etc. And I've seen the evolution in this space from the inside. And the one thing that has remained consistent throughout for the millions of artisanal mining participants is at this interface is that responsible sourcing question is really a survival question. And I want to talk more about that survival question in more detail. Have a look at this map. Galamsey in Ghana, Gamperos in Lusophone Africa, Zama Zama, South Africa, Orpailleurs in Francophone Africa, Ninjas in Mongolia. I could go on. These are not exotic footnotes. They represent over 20 million artisanal miners just in the gold sector. I should make that clear, just in the gold sector, operating in more than 80 countries, producing something like 20% of the world's gold, 85% informal, and I'll use that word lightly. And when you look at this map, you're not looking at a problem outside your gold supply. You're looking at what's inside it. And there's more and more reports coming out now, particularly in parts of Latin America and the Sahel, where criminal groups, where organized crime groups, where a whole lot of different actors are coming in. And now they're saying the gold sector, the illegal gold sector, is worth something like 31 billion US dollars a year. The ASM sector as well suffers, I have to say, from research fatigue, with the analysis leading to the same recommendations we've been talking about since the 90s, with just new buzzwords and sort of more academic typologies. We have no shortage of diagnosis. We know that ASM is embedded in local economies as a core livelihood strategy. Participation, we know, ranges from subsistence to income maximization. And in many contexts, it's economically rational, offering liquidity and immediacy to a lot of our actors, and accessibility that formal systems don't provide. Artisanal miners, in my experience, are making a calculation that isn't irrational. They are being very logical. For instance, large-scale mining concessions, exploration concessions, when we move around, we start to confirm geology, we start to build roads. We're sending economic signals that travel faster, much faster than any sort of management plan. And once established, ASM really disappears. Some common assumptions, and again, I'll go through these quite quickly. Most responses that we still have today are built on such assumptions, and that's why they fail in practice. And those assumptions are now embedded in a lot of global ESG frameworks and alleged sort of best practice strategies, repeating the same rhetoric for the last decades, as I mentioned earlier. Enforcement displaces activity rather than resolves it, and can strengthen criminal actors in many areas. And I've seen this firsthand, I said, from Colombia to Ghana to Tanzania and even Papua New Guinea. Formalization, or what now some folks are calling professionalization, fails to align the incentives of those that it's meant to formalize. We talk about alternative livelihoods that they can't compete with the immediate cash-based income ASM actors can get. And the so-called best practice doesn't necessarily transfer across context or continents. And engagement, which is sometimes treated as endorsement of illegality, is often the only tool that reduces harm to both sides. It's risk management, it's not just endorsement. And these assumptions are not only wrong in principle, they fail consistently under real operating conditions. If we look at the structural drivers, at the core, income differentials are not marginal, they are decisive. They reinforced by informal supply chains that are unregulated and more often efficient, more trusted and more responsive to miners' needs. I'm saying the informal sector actually helps them better than anything the formal sector has built. And this should give us a bit of a pause. The question we should be asking isn't why people use the informal systems, it's why they avoid the formal systems that the global north tries to ask them to join. If the underlying incentives remain unchanged, and that is happening till this day, behavior will not change regardless of the intervention intent or design. And that is the central sort of challenge for sourcing frameworks that continue to rely on formalization as the primary lever to sort of help artisanal miners. I call this a proximity principle. This is a photo I've taken of a mass organized incursion on a gold mining site after a high-grade gold blast. This was highly organized. The closer ASM activity is to large-scale mining operations, the less useful standard response frameworks become. Proximity collapses the distinction between our problem and their problem. For the mining company, this interface is multi-layered risk management challenge, from security to human rights to health and safety. And for the miners, in this photo, for example, the boundary is drawn around their livelihood. Coexistence looks very different depending on which side of the fence or which side of the equipment you're standing on. And for responsible sourcing professionals like you all, the closer that interface is to your supply to an entry point, the more directly these dynamics affect your due diligence obligations. And so many due diligences don't look at this. I should add, in small defensive mining companies, they face what I would call a double bind. They asked to manage coexistence within systems they do not control, under regulatory pressures they did not design, and for systemic constraints they cannot resolve alone. And for a lot of mining companies I work with, acting carries risks, inaction carries blame. Structural tensions. So I'll just talk about this again quite quickly. Legal concessions rights versus local perceptions of legitimacy, generation or customary. A valid concession doesn't automatically translate into local acceptance. Lawyers always walk around legally grandstanding, and it doesn't always help. Legal rights are clear on paper. Legitimacy, I'm afraid, is still negotiated in practice, whether you're in Canada, whether you're in Australia, whether you're in New Guinea or anywhere else. Security enforcement versus human rights risk exposure. As I mentioned earlier, act and you risk escalation, don't act and you risk loss of control. Both pathways carry material consequences to companies, and I've worked with many companies that have faced those consequences, including sourcing your due diligence obligations. There were other trade-offs here, as I've mentioned, operational continuity versus social and political pressure, company responsibility versus limited state capacity, control within the mine fence versus limited influence beyond, and short-term responses versus long-term coexistence reality. Decisions, I'm afraid, being made under pressure today can shape dynamics for years, and tensions tend to formalize if you're not careful. And against the absence of sort of accessible legal pathways for formalization in many countries, from the ASM side, it's a challenge. And if you look at it from that ASM side, the tension is equal. Engage with the company and risk being sort of co-opted or, worse, criminalized. Don't engage and lose the influence over decisions that directly affect your livelihood, your income, what you're doing. And in practice, most mining companies are always managing trade-offs, not solving problems, as I mentioned in my first slide. And the sooner we hope sort of ESG frameworks and sourcing frameworks, responsible frameworks, etc., acknowledge that, I think the more realistic expectations of what, not corporate offices, but what site management can deliver on site. This map is certainly not academic. Look, I've worked on many of these sites personally, from North Mara to Porgera, Boissy, Roosevelt, Gatsup. different countries, different cultures, different decades. And the same structural pattern on every slide. High-grade material near the surface, a legacy of artisanal mining presence that predates sometimes the concession, always followed the concession, the sort of exploration, weak state enforcement, and an economic signal that travels faster than any management plan. These hotspots are concentrating more as we see commodity prices rise, as we see more local unemployment, as we see climate change, as we see migration. And for this audience, again, the point is this: these are not edge cases. They represent the upstream sort of conditions that responsible sourcing systems are specifically designed to address, and where those systems most frequently struggle to deliver. In an increasing number of jurisdictions, and this is the worry, ASM LSM interaction is not an anomaly. It is really part of the operating environment. Just to sort of finish as we head off, I know we want time for questions. Why do these interventions struggle? I mentioned. I've reviewed sort of more ASM type frameworks or best practice than I can count. And we could definitely spend all afternoon talking about them. They tend to be well researched, well designed, and generally thoughtful, I would say. Strong on diagnostics, but limited on execution. Pilots that don't scale, contexts that don't resist replication across jurisdictions or even in the same country. And the sector has really no shortage of what I would call well-intentioned ideas. It has far fewer examples of consistent, scalable, implementable sort of work that you can do on the ground. And this is the real problem that we had: credible implementation where the supply chain can actually look at lives and change the sort of uncertainty I've talked about. Okay, lastly, how do we really get past this? Coexistence is unavoidable. There was a time where companies would live and let live, try a bit of hybridization. But as we go forward, as all the things we're talking about, whether we're talking about critical minerals, commodity prices, coexistence between the large and small scale mining sector has to get better. Security responses, really, really deliver sustainable outcomes. And structured frameworks improve consistency and understanding, but don't eliminate all those trade-offs I talked about that mining companies, operational mining companies struggle with. And genuine government alignment is essential. Again, if government's absence and doesn't do its stuff and just pushes companies, it's really hard for mining companies to operate in a vacuum. So interventions also must be realistic of economic sort of incentives, not just a desired outcome by donors or by ESG frameworks that are sort of written by the downstream actors. It's got to be reality on mine sites today. The objectives, as I said, is not elimination. Artisanal mining is part and will continue to be part of the mining ecosystem. It is a managed interface that has to respect livelihoods. And one measure that we always forget, it seems to disappear from a lot of sourcing frameworks, is whether the lives of artisanal miners and communities got better. Every single responsible mining framework doesn't actually talk about that. It talks about help for up to downstream folks, but not the miners. So I think when we start to talk about the welfare of miners and their communities and that sort of tension, we're much better off. So that's it. Sorry it was rushed. Last week I gave a whole morning to a lot of a whole room full of security professionals, and yesterday the government of Canada hosted about 50 small-scale artisanal mining folks here in Canada, and we were talking at great length and detail. So 10 minutes has been a bit of a rush, but I hope I've managed to give you a little taste of the sort of challenges of ASM where it exists, the formal, the informal side of it, and how sourcing can connect them, and sort of how we can engage to reflect both the operational reality, which we'll forget, and sort of human dignity. That's it. Thanks. Sorry it was quick.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And yeah, I mean, if you're up for doing an entire morning or a day of it, we will quite happily dial in and join you there. It is such a complex situation, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
In terms of, and as you said, there has been so much research done on this, but actually what we need is some sort of action, etc. But often do people underestimate how complex it is? I mean, I know some of the conversations we've had earlier on today with, say, Melody, for example, begins to touch on this area as well. Kevin, if you could wave a magic wand and make something happen, what would it be? Would it be we're just going to coexist and so we actually optimize it for one another, or what is it?
I think the magic one that I would realize is Look, how can I put this diplomatically? I also, now that I'm semi-retired, I'm on the board of a big Canadian NGO here. And one of the things NGOs and the development sector is learning, and I'm new to it, is we seem to import solutions from afar.
Mm.
And I'll use words, it's called neocolonial, it's called racist, you can call it what it wants, but we're coming up with solutions that are designed in the global north for the global south. Same with autism mining. So I think we've got to reverse that. We've got to look at how the development agencies have failed and where they're now learning, and we've got to replicate that. We cannot come up with solutions on our own. And secondly, we've got to listen to the mind, the folks on site. We spend a lot of time with the corporate offices or boards of directors, but the mine site, the GM makes it's the buck stops with them, and they are the ones facing the challenges. As I mentioned when I opened at 2 o'clock in the morning, they're the ones that deal with it, not the legal counsel or the sort of the VP in the head office. So those two things, Sarah.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. Thank you. There's a question from Gavin, and it's a question that Gavin always ponders based on his work in Australia, Papua New Guinea, and elsewhere. So, how much of this problem, in inverted commas, should be government-led versus company solved?
Good question, Gavin. As I mentioned, one of the big things I talked about yesterday with all these Tanzanian miners was what's government doing? Governments around the world, let's start with Ghana, in the 80s had good legislation, and most countries, most have got reasonable legislation, policy, thou shalt do A, B, and C, and D, but they lack the resources to implement. So to answer your question, Gavin, government have to put in the framework, not just the policy or talk about things in the capital, but down in the mining areas so that mining companies can operate. Mining companies cannot be the government. They cannot substitute for that. They can be an actor, but they cannot sort of regulate, enforce, and do what the government should do. So you do need both. And the absence of the government in sort of these countries, in the actual areas around mine sites is a worry. And then I don't know if you saw in one of my slides, I mentioned some of the operations. If you look at Peru, Nigeria, a whole lot of them, Sahel, just now they've talked about something like 3,000 soldiers in the DRC. The US is going to fund for so many million. The enforcement side is getting too much. We're spending more on enforcement than actually coexistence.
Yeah, and I've seen that firsthand in the DRC as well, and it's truly terrifying.
Yeah.
On that delightful note, sorry about that, Kevin. I'm going to
Yeah.
say a massive thank you
Thank
once
you.
again. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you very
Thank you.
much.